Well, hi. So now I'm going to be looking at my third round game from the 45-45 League, and I had black again, and this time my opponent is called Jesse HF, and okay, so he played one knight f3, I went d5, e3, knight f6, c4, e6. Um, in a game a month ago, over the board, someone played knight c3 against me in this position from a different move order. He started with the English 1c4, and we had an interesting game, which I eventually won. In the game, my opponent played d4, transposing to a sort of Queen's Gambit declined type of position where white's played an early e3, which is not sort of undeniably not the most ambitious continuation, but it's certainly playable. And one of the main lines of this sequence is c5, cd5, ed5, and well, at some point, someone is likely to trade these pawns on c5 and d4, and then black's going to be left with an isolated queen's pawn on d5, and white often plays bishop b5 check here in an attempt to either establish a pin if black plays knight c6, or if he plays bishop d7 to trade off a set of pieces before getting the isolated queen's pawn position, which tends to be favorable for the side fighting against it. So I played the move a6, which I think is an interesting move. I've played it once before in an over-the-board game. I got quite a good position out of the opening, but eventually the game was a draw. My opponent played knight c3, which is, in this game and in that game as well, knight c3 was played in both, and I played d takes c4. Bishop takes c4 and now b5, and black's idea is to transpose to a line of, well, you can call it a number of different things, either a Queen's Gambit accepted or a Vienna variation. For example, one way to get this would be, say, d4, knight f6, c4, that's not c4, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, d takes c4. And here e4 is supposed to be the critical move, but if they play e3 instead, which is playable and quite common, a6. And here they usually play a4. Well, usually, yeah, it's slightly more common than bishop takes c4. And after b5, black's position is supposed to be relatively comfortable. And this is the same thing we got in the game. And the reason why black's position is supposed to be comfortable... Okay, well, let's retreat the bishop. In this case, he went to e2. Of course, it's also possible to go to b3 or d3. But in this case, he chose the e2 square. And basically, the problem white has here, compared to the Queen's Gambit accepted proper, where the knight would... I didn't mean to scroll there. Where the knight would still be on b1, is that, if you play a4, b4 is going to hit the knight, and then the knight has to go back. Whereas if the knight were still on b1, when you play a4, and black plays b4, then the knight can go to d2 and have a nice square on c4. Quite a nice square for the knight. Whereas here, actually, as happens in the game... I think, yeah, the knight doesn't make it to c4. He goes a4, I play b4, he goes knight back, and then he goes to d2, and then he goes to c4. So that's, you're spending 2 tempi with the knight to go out and back. Now, yeah, if the knight is still on b1, black probably wouldn't go b5 quite as quickly to avoid basically allowing white to save sort of 2 tempi on what he got in this game. So anyways, bishop b2 was played. Bishop b7, castles, knight bd7. This is, both players are developing their pieces. b3, and here, c5 is quite a natural move, sort of in line with the Queen's Gambit accepted, and black should have reasonably comfortable play. Like you say, okay, one more possible line here, bishop b2, the bishop can go basically whichever square it wants, let's say to d6. Bishop b7 is slightly more common, but this looks a little more active. dc5 is possible, let's say it goes rook c1, castles, and black often follows up with queen b8, or queen b6, or sometimes queen c7, but I don't know if queen c7 is so good here with the rook going the open thing. Rook's to the center of files, and black should be fairly comfortable. In the game I played bishop d6, which is an idea I remember seeing in a Magnus Carlsen, I think is a blitz game, where basically instead of going for c5, he decides to kind of switch gears, castle, play queen e7, and go for e5, which I thought was quite an interesting plan. and neither of us had spent much time by this point, but okay, bishop b2, castles, both sides are just making natural moves, rook c1, queen to e7, and, well, there's still games in the database here. Like, there's a game from 1988 between Ulf Andersson and Alexander Belyavsky, two fairly well-known players. And here white played the move a4, which I think is a good move, because the problem is white's sort of developed all of his pieces, but there's not a terribly natural next step, and if you allow black to get an e5 sort of quote-unquote cleanly, then these bishops pointed at the king side could be quite strong for black. So he played a4 sort of in an effort just to give black some problems to deal with. I played b4, I played knight b1. Of course, neither of us were really in quote-unquote theory at this point, but there are still games in the database with this. And this is the idea I mentioned before. White baits b4 to weaken the c4 square. Black gains some time because white's got to go back with the knight, but white gains this potentially very nice c4 square for the knight, which in this case annoys this bishop, although that's not true in every case. It can hop to a5, it can hop to e5. But black has enough time to sort of complete development in the meantime. So c5. The problem e5 I was considering, I don't think e5 is that great. And again, as in the previous videos, if you've watched those, I'm sort of doing analysis on the fly. I thought e5 was okay, but I wanted to keep more tension in the position. And I kind of thought white might be able to just trade everything and be reasonably comfortable. Like, say, queen c2. This is the kind of thing I was looking at. And this I wasn't entirely sure how to evaluate. Or hang on. Was it this? No, maybe not queen c2 right away. Somehow queen g5 wasn't that attractive in my line that I had in my head. Even here, queen g5 can be met by g3, and white's probably not worse. But maybe it was knight d2 I was looking at, and then if queen g5, white was putting a piece on f3. Either way, this looked fine for black, but it didn't seem. Well, I wanted to keep more tension in the position, and white's not obligated to take twice on e5 either. He can play knight bd2, but if knight bd2, I think pieces stay on the board and black should be okay. And I think there are some attacking chances towards the king side, but the problem you have to worry about is the c7 pawn might become weak, or the knight might eventually hop to this square, for example, or b4 might become weak, or you play like a5 to freeze. Not freeze, but like fix these pawns apart from each other. Anyways, I played c5, as most of the people in the database did, including Belyavsky, and some other guys like Parligras, and Peter Axe, and Esipenko, Andrei Esipenko. Okay. Those are all 2450 plus players, in some cases 2600 plus. Some people also played rook fd8 here, which is also a move I was considering, but I didn't want to spend too much time in the opening here. Rook fd8 keeps both pawn breaks in reserve. And there's one game here where black played knight bd2, and then c5 was played, reaching something similar to the game. Actually, in fact, yeah, just transposing into the game. So that's fine. Anyways, I went c5. He played knight bd2. I played rook fd8. Which, alright, yeah, I mean, you can develop the pieces in a number of different ways. cd4 is possible, but cd4 I wasn't sure I wanted to do straight away, because, I mean, first of all, if e5, then knight f5, which is kind of annoying. You can put the knight on c5, and it's no doubt fine for black. But I just wanted to get my rooks to central files first, and, well, there's nothing particularly wrong with that. Here he played the move rook c2, which surprised me, because I was almost certain knight c4 was coming. Because, well, it's this sort of natural conclusion to this whole operation white did with a4, b4, knight b1, knight d2, knight b2, knight c4. But he didn't play it yet, and he didn't play it for a few moves, but he played an idea that was quite interesting and actually proved to be quite annoying. If knight c4, I was planning to play bishop c7, which I think is important. First of all, because if you go to b8, the rook has a harder time getting out, but also importantly, I think it's quite important to stop white playing knight a5, which is probably quite annoying for the bishop on b7. Therefore, okay. Yeah. So, yeah, some games continued like this. Knight c4, bishop c2, and now, for example, knight f to d2 can be played. And one game here just went cd4. White played ed4, and then black played knight d5, and I suspect this should be okay for black, even though white eventually won. This looks fairly comfortable. Although the computer is giving white a slight advantage. I wouldn't mind being black here, I think. So, that's just one game. You probably also can take back the bishop here, and you can play moves that aren't knight fd2, such as queen c2. At which point black can... Well, in this game he played bishop e4. I suspect he can also play rook a c8 or something. Anyways, going back to the game, my opponent played rook c2, which really was surprising, because I didn't understand what the point of this move was at first. But it was quite an interesting idea to put the queen on a8 in sort of hyper-modern, traditional hyper-modern style and exert pressure along this diagonal. Which is quite an annoying practical idea. Computer doesn't, well, it doesn't hate it, but doesn't think it's the best move. But I think this is quite a clever idea. So rook c2, rook a c8, queen to a1. I played cd4 here, because the thing is, like, I've developed all my pieces, and I'm kind of wondering what I'm supposed to do next. And the thing with the queen on a1 is it's too late to revert back to this idea of playing e5, because there's no e5 anymore, because white is covering the square 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and black is only covering it, 1, 2, 3 times. So that's not on the table anymore. Even if your rook were on e8, it's still not on the table. Let's see what the computer wants to play here. It wants knight e4, which I think makes sense. But in all of these lines, I was kind of worried about moving... This is why I thought queen a1 was so annoying practically, because I'm always worried about moving my knight off of f6, because somehow the diagonal opens and then bishop takes g7 happens. But, knight e4 I didn't give much consideration for some reason. But that does look like a decent move, because if knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, that's quite annoying for the rook on c2. But what happens after... So dc5, knight dc5, and I assume you can't take on g7 for some reason. Oh. Yeah, that'll do it. Actually, many moves it says are strong here. e5 is strong, knight takes d2 is strong. But yeah, knight takes b3 is a trick that just works. So yeah, knight e4, I'm not sure why I didn't put more thought into that, because that does look like a natural and active move. But okay, I played cd4 because I wanted to start getting my pieces active. And I had this idea of, like, after the knight recaptures on d4, I was somehow going to give mate on the king side. With... Well, my fantasy was... Okay, let me just make a bunch of super cooperative moves. Okay. Okay. Obviously, white's been quite cooperative in this sequence, but this is sort of what I was dreaming of. And then something like bishop takes h2 check, or like knight g4. Wow, what I was really dreaming of was this. But, okay. There's h3 as well, and then, I don't know, queen h4 or something. And I'm threatening queen takes h3, actually. Anyways. But yeah, none of these moves need to happen from white's point of view. Still, c takes d4 isn't a bad move. It does open this diagonal for some annoyances, and this battery actually proved much more annoying, at least in practice, than I expected it to be. And the thing is, well, yeah, if white wants to open this diagonal, I guess you probably want to wait for him to do it with d takes c5, because that way you activate your knight sort of quote-unquote for free. But on the other hand, he brought his knight to d4 to recapture, and then later in the game he brought it back. So I'm not sure how to feel about the c takes d4 move. I think it's okay. He didn't play knight takes d4 because he didn't want his knight to be dragged back to c2, which is fair. So he took on c8 first. I played rook takes c8 to keep the bishop on this diagonal, and then he played knight takes d4. Now everything that's happened so far in the game has been pretty much normal. Now I started doing some strange things, because I thought, okay, the position's equal. Maybe I'm a bit better. Maybe he's a bit better, I have no idea. But, I kind of want to win the game, yeah? So, and I still had, like, these bishops here. And the fact that white's play in the opening wasn't terribly ambitious led me to think, okay, I can go for some sort of mating attack in some ideal scenario. Problem is, you know, if white plays well, this ideal scenario is not really going to arise, because it's not like you've got a winning position and you're trying to cap it off with a mating attack. You know... You're a bit better than equal, sort of, at best. So doing weird things is sort of completely unjustified at this point in time. But things didn't actually go genuinely wrong until much later, but we'll get to that. Black should play a simple move here, knight c5, for example. e5, once again, knight f5 is possible. But e5, I'm not sure, is actually strategically desirable for black in any case, because it blocks the bishop on d6, and the e5 pawn is potentially a weakness, and so on and so forth. And even if you advance the pawn to e4, it blocks this bishop, and yeah, it's hard to make use of these squares here. And there's never really any knight g4. One thing I was looking at that I'm sort of curious about, I spent a long time considering knight e5, which I think, well, it looks natural enough. But I think coupled with this idea of trying to somehow play one of the knights to g4 and give mates, I was trying to make that work for a while, but I think it just doesn't, because if ever white gets into really, really serious trouble, he can always just put one of the knights on f3 and I think cover h2 and just be fine. Not to say knight e5 is a bad move. I don't think it's a bad move by any stretch, but I think the move I was expecting here would have been knight 4 f3, and I thought it would be annoying. Like if I play a move like knight g6, I wasn't sure how annoying bishop takes f6 would be, because it sort of messes black's pawn structure. On the king side, black gets 2 bishops. Maybe you can play something like bishop e3 and knight e4. I didn't really know. But on the other hand, you can maybe play king h8 and rook g8, but if you do that, you give up the c file potentially. I really wasn't sure what to think about this. And well, first of all, I wasn't sure transferring the knight to g6 actually did me any good. Because I'm not sure what the knight is particularly doing on g6, even if white decides not to take on f6, because there's not really a knight jump to h4, for example. Which would... Well, there could be a knight jump to h4 in the future, but not yet. Knight eg4 doesn't really work with a knight sitting on f3. And if you just trade knights, I don't know what black's gained from this, really. Especially if you're trying to keep the game complex. Swapping on f3, and if it takes back with the bishop, and then swapping again, it's not really... It's fine for black, but it's not really what I wanted. In fact, the computer wants to play just knight ed7 back. Which, okay. Anyways. Yeah, knight e5 is not a bad move. The computer wants to play knight c5, and that's an extremely natural move as well. But I played knight b6, which is a weird move that I don't like. It's not horrible, but it's a weird move. The way I wrote some things in the spectator chat about this move, and basically what I wanted to do... Well, there are a few different ideas. First of all, this knight, I thought on a good day it might come to d5 and then c3. Another idea was I thought this knight on d5 protected the knight on f6 against any, weird knight going back, taking on f6 and doubling the pawns thing. Once again, I'm not sure how worried I should actually be about this, but also I thought at some stage I might be able to swing my queen to c7 and target the king side, because once again I still had these dreams of a king side attack. Or like, if white challenges the c file, I had this idea of playing bishop back, something like bishop back and queen to d6, which I don't think ever particularly works if white isn't cooperative, but anyways. a5 looks tempting, but I don't think it's a great move, because the knight goes to d5, and this sort of furthers black's plan anyways, of getting the knight closer. Just keep getting the knight on d5, which is where apparently I wanted the knight, even though it doesn't make all that much sense. He played rook c1, which is a natural move, surely, and here I played another weird move, bishop c7. Yeah. At this point, I was actually moving fairly quickly, because I think I had a decent idea of what I want. Well, okay, you can see here the clock, I spent a while, 11, 12 minutes, which is a lot for a 45-45 game, on knight b6, because I really wasn't sure how to proceed with my position. Bishop c7 I played without that much thought, and I mean, well, the thing was, yeah, I didn't want to exchange rooks. I wanted to keep rooks on the board. And by the way, speaking of keeping rooks on the board, I had this one weird idea of playing rook c5 and swinging the rook over, but once again, with the knight coming to f3, this really doesn't work. And like, if you try to hide out on g6, there's bishop d3. Yeah. So anyways, I wanted to keep rooks on the board. My original intention was rook to d8, and I had this sequence calculated where if you try to play knight c6, black takes it, takes, and rook takes d2, and if check, you block with the knight. If takes, then you take back with the pawn to avoid getting back rank mated. And if rook takes b6, well, my original intention was rook takes e2, but actually there's just queen c7 check and queen takes rook. But, okay, turning on the computer thinks this doesn't work for black, which is fair enough. It wants either bishop to f3, and then argues that black doesn't have a particularly good move, and even though black's up a pawn, the bishops are extremely strong, and the rook is active, and black faces a precarious defense, which is fair. It also likes bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and queen e1. Or bishop takes a6. Yeah, that's annoying as well, but queen e1 is a nice move. Rook to d8. You still can't take the knight because of queen c7 check, but you can take on a6 now, and protected past a pawn outside. The king is a bit weak. White's king optically looks a bit weak, but it can hide back on g1. I suspect black's king is the weaker of the two. So okay, fair enough. So curious. On rook d8. Oh, it just thinks rook d8 is dubious because of knight c6. Fair enough. So what does it want instead of bishop c7 or rook d8? Because those are the two main moves I was considering, because I didn't want to trade rooks for whatever reason. Yeah, it just wants to take on c1 or play. In fact, one of its top choices is knight bd7 back, which is kind of depressing. That's a little bit depressing. Yeah. Although I guess it makes sense to admit that your knight b6 move didn't make a ton of sense. But once again, I was just too overly ambitious in this game, and yeah. Bishop c7, not taking anything away from my opponent. My opponent played very well, but I sort of self-destructed at some points. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but okay, anyways. Bishop c7. Again, coupled with this sort of optimistic idea of playing queen to d6, with mate threats on the king side, and I wanted to bring the rook to d8, and then I thought, this knight comes to d5, maybe this bishop comes to b6, and black's got a reasonably active setup. So now my opponent sets about deploying his pieces. He goes knight 4 to f3. Clearing this diagonal is at this point I sort of realized, okay, that's quite annoying because maybe you take on f6, but even if you don't, the knight is kind of pinned to the g7 pawn behind it, which becomes annoying if you try to play an active move like knight e4 at some stage. However, as we'll find out, yeah, there's some complications to this. Okay, computer didn't think knight 4 to f3 was the absolute best move. Yeah, it wants bishop f3, which makes a lot of sense. And probably would make me feel somewhat silly about my intention, because once his bishop comes off the board, there's not really a kingside attack. Well, there isn't really a kingside attack regardless, but once his bishop disappears, it's evident there's not going to be a kingside attack. But okay, he played this move, which is fine, and his idea is he wants to, well, he set the knight to d4 to recapture a pawn, but he doesn't really like it there, so he's sending it back to clear this diagonal, and he's got this plan of playing knight to c4 and potentially one of the knights to e5. So that's quite an active deployment of white's pieces. I decided to mimic this deployment. Does it still want knight bd7? Hang on, let's take a look. Yeah, it still wants knight bd7, but okay, knight bd5 isn't a bad move in this case. And here he played the move knight c4. Now, on knight c4 I had a move in mind, but then I thought the move I had in mind was just hung a pawn once it appeared on the board, but it turns out my move is actually good anyways, but I didn't play it because, yeah. Anyways, knight e5 is the move the computer wants, and it thinks knight c4, my opponent's move, is bad. And like back at some point, I was planning, whenever the knight goes to c4, I thought I was going to play knight e4, and my idea was, well, the knight's quite active on e4, maybe there's some threats somewhere over here, but my main idea is I just want to put a knight on c3. And I think this is quite a good idea. It's very, very hard to execute. Well, it's not very hard to execute, but it's not easy to execute. But in this case, it's possible. And once the knight gets to c3, that's a very good square for the knight, but it also basically eliminates the influence of this battery, which is one of the main pluses about white's position at this point in time, in my opinion. But obviously, the obvious question is what happens if bishop takes g7, and this is, of course, what dissuaded me from playing knight e4. But it turns out this is just good for black. After f6, bishop h6. In fact, once I noticed g7 was hanging, I just stopped thinking about this. But after, well, it even says many moves are good for black here. Knight ec3 is its top choice. It also thinks queen f7 is good, and it says black just has great compensation. This bishop is stuck out of play. You've got two great bishops. You can maybe even play king h8, rook g8 at some point. The queen can swing over to the king side to, well, annoy this bishop for one thing, and it thinks black's just doing great. So knight e4, a clear improvement over my play. Instead, I played a move that, well, obviously, you know, conveys the fact that I think that knight e4, bishop takes g7 just wins a pawn. I played queen f8, which, well, obviously has one purpose in mind, to cover g7 in order to bring the knight to e4. And I think this is positionally well-founded, but it's slow. Computer wants to play knight fd2 here, which is a bit of a strange-looking move, but it does stop knight e4, and I think white really cannot afford to allow knight e4 and a knight to land on c3, because, well, in the other line, even when he was winning a pawn, he shouldn't be allowing this. Although there were other sort of complicating factors. The bishop was getting stuck over on h6 and so on and so forth. But okay, he played the move bishop d3, which I think is a good move, stopping knight e4 and aiming the bishop at the king side. I played rook to d8, which, yeah, ensures these rooks stay on the board, because I was really adamant on that for some reason. But also, it puts the rook opposite this temporarily loose bishop on d3, and it might threaten something like knight to, well, not right away, actually, because knight takes e3, knight takes e3, rook takes d3, there's rook takes c7, but it introduces these ideas in the air. Maybe knight f4, but you do also always have to watch out for bishop takes f6. I'm not sure, but I think rook d8 is an okay move. What does the computer say? a5 makes sense. It also wants knight d7, just to get out of these threats. Okay. Rook d8, and here I thought if he plays e4 with the idea of chasing the problem with this maneuver of the knight to d5 where it covers f6 is these knights defend each other, but the defense is a bit questionable when bishop d3 and e4 is coming into the mix. But e4 I thought I could play knight c3. No, here I have knight f4, sorry. But later on I don't have knight f4. But here knight f4 just works because the bishop on f3 is loose, and then, yeah. But also knight c3 might be possible, but this is just great for black. After bishop takes f6, you play rook takes d3. With just an overwhelming position for black, because everything's working for him all of a sudden. Like, the bishop's hit, you have to lose your tempo, e4 is hanging, something bad is likely to happen along this diagonal, etc. So he played knight c to e5, which was his idea from before. He centralizes this knight, defends this bishop, introduces some ideas into the picture on the king's side, opens the rook towards the bishop here. And here I thought, yeah, something like e4, knight moves, rook takes c7 might eventually be a threat, especially with the rook hitting the bishop on d7. So I played bishop to b6, which is a mistake apparently, due to an idea that I don't think either of us had seen. Well, I won't speak for him, of course. I hadn't seen it. Like, I don't think I'd even spent 2 seconds considering it, but looking at the position now, it's actually quite obvious, but we'll get to that later. In fact, the computer says that white e4 is just not a problem, even though I was quite scared of it. It wants to just play h6, and the fact that I'm telling you that h6 is the computer's recommended move sort of gives away how white should meet bishop b6. But anyways, what happens after e4? So on e4, you just take? See, this is sort of what I didn't want to do. And then it just wants to go knight c3. Okay. And argues that after takes, the fact that the c3 pawn might fall is balanced out by the fact that the e4 pawn is hanging. That's fair. Okay. But I didn't see anything wrong with bishop b6, because like I said, I'd missed a possibility for white on the next turn. First of all, a5, I was intending, I think, to go bishop a7. Oh, which is bad because of the same... Yeah, okay. But yeah, the problem with bishop b6, he played rook d1 in the game, but simply knight g5 is just really strong. And I didn't see this idea. It looks really obvious now. It just, white's hitting f7 twice. It just didn't occur to me in the slightest, and black, I think, is already almost losing. Basically, you have one attempt, which is knight takes e3. And here the computer gives the line, well, if f takes e3, then bishop takes e3 and bishop takes g5, and that's good for black, because you win material and eliminate this threat against f7. a5, bishop c5, and now queen b1. And, well, it's possible my opponent saw knight g5, and then rejected it because of knight takes e3. To be totally honest, I didn't see knight g5 at all. He played rook d1, and he said afterwards that he was basically playing for a draw around this point. And yeah, probably that is kind of a fair result from this sort of position, although, you know, there's still things that can happen for both sides. I played rook c8, again with this idea of playing knight c3. I thought he might play rook c1, at which point I was sort of thinking about playing rook d8, although this does give him another chance to play knight g5, which I'd still yet to notice. Knight c4, bishop c7, rook c1, and now black should play a solid move, and it's about equal. But instead, I got an idea, and it's an idea that's bad. I mean, yeah. So basically, up to this point in the game, nothing too horrible has happened. Like, I mean, there was about one missed opportunity on both sides, but aside from that, the game has been sort of roughly balanced. But here's where it sort of takes a turn for uh, for something really bad for black, and it doesn't get so horrible for black at first, but it just sort of, yeah. Just one mistake and then further mistakes keep sort of piling up after that. So you can see on the clock, my opponent had about this much time. I had about 10 minutes left. Yeah. Actually, it's been a theme throughout my games in the season of the 45-45 league. I keep complicating positions in my own time trouble for some reason. I don't know if in a 45-minute game, 10 minutes is considered time trouble, but it's not very much time. Especially when in context, over-the-board games are often 90 plus 30, and 10 minutes is just basically nothing compared to 90 minutes. Compared to 45 minutes, it's a bit more. But anyways, without getting into the semantics of what defines time trouble, computer wants to play knight d7 here. That's a simple enough move. But I had an idea, and I played knight c3. And, well, one of the things about knight c3 is I was just getting sick of looking at this battery. So I wanted to get rid of this bishop, play bishop takes f3, ruin the white kingside structure, and potentially go for some kind of attack. So bishop takes c3. Oh, by the way, I should... Hang on. There was some other point I wanted to mention somewhere. I got distracted by the fact that knight g5 just... Yeah, anyways. There was some point here somewhere that I wanted to... Oh yeah, here. I thought white might try e4. With the idea that if the knight goes somewhere random, you might take on f6. Curious what the computer says about this. And this, I thought knight f4 didn't work because of bishop takes f6. And this seemed good for white. Computer says it's still okay for black. But anyways, the move I was intending here was knight c3. Bishop takes c3, b takes c3. And if queen takes c3 to take on e4. I was sort of curious about what happens if white... Okay, well, takes... And this is... I thought it was okay for black. This is actually better for black, according to the computer. Happens after rook e1, for example. I was going to play queen b4, and yeah, the computer agrees queen b4 is a good move. Better for black. So that was... Okay, I was thinking white might try e4, because I thought knight c3 was okay for me, but I wasn't 100% sure. But okay, he played rook c1, and I went knight c3, which was too optimistic. And my idea was this. After takes, queen takes c3, bishop takes f3. Of course, white can also not take this pawn and just make a different move, but yeah, there's no reason not to take it straight away. Takes, and here my point was queen c5. And queen c5 I thought was the key move to justify this whole knight c3 idea. And the computer thinks knight c3 is not a good move, but it's not disastrous yet. But it thinks queen c5 just makes it worse and wants to play knight d5 instead. But basically my idea with queen c5, I thought I had to do something to justify sacrificing this pawn. And the idea was I wanted to bring my queen over to one of these squares to start an attack. And also there are potentially ideas of playing bishop e5 or bishop a5 to confuse the issue. Or, like, this is an idea in some positions. In fact, the computer wants to do this straight away. Knight d5, knight b4. And it thinks black is worse but not losing yet. But I just missed a few things. First of all, f4 is a decent move. Basically, the problem with black's position, I mentioned it in the spectator room chat during the game, that this bishop and this rook are very awkward with the pressure along the c-file. I didn't see any way for white to exploit that, but my opponent found a very nice way to exploit it. First of all, it turns out after f4, black probably doesn't have sufficient compensation, because if you do anything too ambitious, like queen h5, you run into maybe some trick, knight b6. Yeah, knight b6 probably, or knight e5. But actually, it turns out a very strong move is just knight e5 straight away, which I'd completely missed. And this is a good move by my opponent. We're getting into, we both have about 8 minutes left. This is a very nice move because you can't take the knight. And now the queen's hit, and you don't have a ton of options because going into this ending, well, it's very hard to see how you're going to unpin these pieces. So I was debating between queen takes c3 and queen d6. Queen d6, I thought he would just play f4 and follow it up with maybe at some point queen c6 to try to force an ending, but even he didn't have to do that. Knight d5 I thought was going to be met with queen c6, which is probably an okay move. Computer wants queen c2, hitting h7, followed by bishop e4. And yeah, that's quite strong as well. White's winning. So I decided to go for this ending where I thought well, okay, damage mitigation, I might be okay here. It's still better for white, but there are some chances because the opposite color bishops, double pawns over here. He's still got this pawn majority over here, and also the pawn on a6 is potentially going to fall, and black is still in this pin. But I thought I might have some tactical tricks related to bishop takes h2 check, and rook takes something on the c-file. And here I made a further mistake, which, yeah, basically eliminates any realistic chances of holding the game. f6, which is just a ridiculous move. And actually, I thought white's idea might be to put the knight on c4 or something. And then I thought, well, I can park the knight on b4, play something like a5. If I move my bishop, the knight will be temporarily pinned back to the rook on c1. And I thought that would be more or less reasonable for me. But actually, I just completely missed. First of all, actually, it turns out knight c6 is quite strong, but I just completely missed bishop takes a6. And yeah, because, well, I thought, first of all, if rook a8, then bishop b7. This doesn't work for black. I thought I could just play rook to b8, and on knight takes c6, play rook takes b3, and on bishop c4, play rook to c3, and I was keeping all my pieces safe, and I thought I was fine here. Which I would be if not for rook takes c3, knight takes c3, and then bishop takes e6. And I think around this point somewhere I had realized what was happening, because if the pawn is still on f7, black's sort of okay here, but of course the pawn's not still on f7. The pawn on e6 falls, and then black is 2 pawns down, and then really is just completely lost. Instead of f6, black should notice this trick. Just get out of the pin. Threaten the knight on e5, so white doesn't yet have time to take on a6, I think. And on knight to c6, you can probably play rook takes b3, bishop takes a6, and something like either rook to a3 or king to f8 or something to that effect. And black's worse. Black's definitely worse. White has this outside passed a pawn. He can put his rook behind it. Well, this is why I think maybe you should choose rook a3 instead of king f8. I'm not sure. But there are some holding chances for black, opposite colored bishops, and you might hold the position. Weird things can happen in time trouble, of course, but yeah. But f6, yeah. And then when you're 2 pawns down, you really just don't stand a chance of holding this. Tried some things happen. The pawn on h7 eventually fell because, well, if you don't, yeah. Otherwise, this is just going to happen. So I made some sort of attempt to not get my knight back into play, and then I played knight e7, which is really just a bluff. Because, well, this ending is a pure opposite color bishop ending, but white's 3 pawns up and should win this quite easily. I assume. I'm not going to take a detailed look at this. I'm sure there are better ways to try to hold this. Like, you can try king f7 to threaten g6, but the bishop goes back, and I'm not sure how black should set up his pawns, but I suspect he's losing regardless. I thought maybe g5 to, but it really doesn't matter. White eventually should win the game. And okay, well, here I should have played king f7, but I had already sort of resigned myself to losing the game at this point. I played king f8, king g6, and now the pawn just runs to h6, and that basically decides the game. So I resigned here. So good game by my opponent. Very well played. There were some missed chances earlier on. Like I had this chance to play knight e4, which I didn't take, but because I was worried about the g7 pawn falling, and I played queen f8 instead, which is too slow. And then he had this chance to play knight to g5, which is quite strong. And then I just, yeah, misguided plan here. Missing knight e5, but also misevaluating the position after f4. And then the game basically ended after f6, which is just a tactical mistake, which was well exploited by my opponent. Okay, so 1.5 out of 3. Yeah, I don't know. I really should stop complicating positions in my own time trouble. Like, this is a fairly safe, solid position. Shouldn't be overly ambitious here. Just yeah. Make a solid move. Make a draw if you have to. Don't self-destruct. Yeah. That's all for this week. See you next week, or maybe the week after. I don't know.